Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Azure podcast. I'm your host, Evan Baslick, joined by my fellow co-host today, Sujit. The rest of the team is taking a well-deserved day, and I'd say enjoying themselves somewhere, but they're probably frantically trying to keep up with their work. This is episode number 462. We'll be talking about AKS LTS and with Jorge Palma from the AKS team. And we are recording this on May 22nd, and this is the week of build. So we're actually not going to talk about anything build related this week, but lots of stuff. By the time this comes out, a whole bunch of stuff will have gotten announced. So please do check out your build feeds if you haven't already. So we've had a couple of shows just in the last couple of weeks that we've recorded. So not to mention build. So everybody's holding their news. So there is no new news this week. So luckily, Jorge is going to be here to talk to us about this stuff. So Jorge, I don't know, tell us who you are and what you do here at Microsoft.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Evan. So my name is Jorge Palma. I'm the lead PM for the Azure Kubernetes service team. Been around for a while and super happy to be here.
Great. It's actually really nice to talk to you in a positive conversation, right? You and I only typically run into each other when somebody's really unhappy with some element of AKS. So it's good to work with you in that sense. Let's start out with the obvious one. What is LTS and why is it such a big deal that this exists for Azure Kubernetes service?
Yeah, absolutely. We're lucky we do have Build Week coming this time around, but we did have quite a few announcements at KubeCon a couple of weeks ago. So we're kind of doing a double dip in the month of May and April because we had two events in the fast follow. One of them was LTS that we announced at KubeCon, stands for long-term support, and it's basically the culmination of a lot of feedback from our users and from even be it internal or third-party customers that struggle a lot with the Kubernetes just rate of innovation and updates. And so Kubernetes originally had pretty much a version every 3 months. Then, as part of kind of the first effort to try and address this, and it was the first iteration of what was called the LTS working group in upstream Kubernetes that shifted into 4 months, and that actually
Four
it
whole
is
months.
somewhat of a difference because it moved from 9 months of support of one version to 12 months. So you
Okay.
chipped away 1 month for each one of those, and so that enabled each minor version. So by a minor version I mean something like 1.26. That 26 is the minor version that would be supported for 12 months. That was still fairly challenging for enterprise users, cases of like independent software vendors that actually might have different providers where they provide their solutions towards and might have periods of validation. So sometimes adoption and then validation and then distribution, all that would eat away a lot of time for that version. And so we always had to kind of play within the bounds of Kubernetes upstream because on AKS we're 100% vanilla Kubernetes. We intend to always be 100% vanilla Kubernetes, ensure all the compatibility, portability that Kubernetes offers. But then that kind of forces us to take a hard decision here: is like, do we keep versions, out of their support window upstream, meaning when upstream is actually producing patches and we're consuming them, and that means that cluster becomes vulnerable and it's a danger to us in our fleet, to the users, to their users across the board, or do we actually fork the project, which is the only other option, to actually be able to cherry pick things into it, and that is extremely costly, extremely laborious because Kubernetes is luckily a project with a ton of contributions and effort from the upstream communities, and really no single vendor is able to replace that. And so even trying to do something as seemingly small scope as porting security fixes to a fork version of Kubernetes is extremely laborious. And it would always kind of risk a little bit if you go too much, go overboard with that fork. You could just get too much into that fork and then compromise um, portability itself. So as part of a long time ago, I was listening and working through it, we decided to kind of announce this long-term support feature that will come in for specific versions. The first one, we're currently planning for it to be 1.27, which is about to be shipped. And that will give 2 years of total time for support, whereafter the upstream support period ends, after those 12 months, that 1 year, we're going to be the ones cherry picking security fixes and only security fixes from
I was going to ask that.
upstream Kubernetes onto AKS, again, in order to mitigate the risk of drift of that fork and things like that. And we're also going to guarantee the upgrade from that LTS into the next LTS that we're going to be testing and that we're going to be introducing, from full-on upstream master branch, so that new LTS is not going to come from our LTS forks or anything like it. It's going to continue to be stripped from upstream, and it will be 100% upstream until the end of that 1 year, and then we'll start to do, cherry picks again and all those fixes again.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad to hear that, George. But I want to find out, just to kind of level set for our listeners, what's the process typically that Microsoft goes through to, to get these versions? These versions are coming out on the open source Kubernetes GitHub site, and at some point we're taking them and we're, I guess, making them available in AKS. Like typically in AKS, you get a choice of maybe 2 or 3 versions. I forget how many. It's not like you can go back like 10 versions or something like that. So there's a process that we go through to say, okay, we're going to onboard these versions into AKS, and at some point they're getting offboarded, I suppose, right, when they're getting out of support. So give us an idea as to, what that timeline looks like for the product, and then maybe that will help tie into what you're talking about with the LTS distribution.
Yeah, for sure, and that time is very much, as I was alluding to before, determined by upstream. So essentially, what happens is when Kubernetes ships a new version, like 1.27 just came out, and we're going to introduce it this month. So we typically, as soon as it comes out, we test it, we validate it within Codebase for our add-ons, for our customers, for our fleet infrastructure, etc. And then after that test, we introduce it in preview. We give users and customers the time to actually also test it and for any new behavior to be flushed out, to do some bake time there, and then we GA it after those 30 days, and any fixes, any tweaks that we need to do to it based on feedback. Then from there, it has that 1 year of support that I mentioned before. And that year support happens because Kubernetes, and I kind of didn't mention that on my first part of the answer, has 3 versions at every given time. So at every given moment, Kubernetes upstream holds 3 versions. So right now it's 27, 26, and 25, which means that those are the only 3 versions that get patch versions produced for them. And so AKS has the exact same thing, unsurprisingly, where we have those same 3 versions during that year, and we introduce the patches that upstream brings. And so what we're really saying is, once the DLTS version specifically goes out of that 1 year of upstream support and patches stop being produced by upstream, we're going to be cherry picking those security patches and those security fixes and commits into that LTS version and producing those private patches for customers to be able to consume in the same way that they would in an upstream support version.
And in that case, then you would have maybe four options in the version dropdown. That'd be 1 LTS and 3, I guess, non-LTS versions, something like that.
That's correct. That's exactly it. So during, for example, as we introduce 127, that's going to still be 3 until the end of 127 support, and then 127 will become, just accessible via the LTS functionality. That's the only way you're going to be able to create clusters with it, etc. And the 3 versions window of upstream support will maintain and will keep moving exactly as until now, with no change whatsoever. A lot of our customers are, thankfully, and that is still what we recommend, following the upstream train. So they get all the new, not just security, but all the fixes. They get all the new functionality, and they're just, with their cloud native applications, being able to produce that. They're even in auto upgrade modes. That's definitely what they should be doing. But for those specific use cases that might struggle, those specific workloads, maybe they're somewhat legacy and no one wants to touch them that frequently, or the ISVKs that I mentioned, they'll have the opportunity to stay for 2 years in that version.
Do you talked about, and I think this is a really good thing about AKS, and y'all stuck by this premise for all the years that I've been watching the service. There's nothing sort of different about what's going on in Azure Kubernetes Service versus Kubernetes in general. Anything y'all have to fix, you push into the main branch, right, into upstream branch. You know, it's always going to be there. It, you know, I think I heard you mention that if you're running this LTS, this long-term support branch, we would support you upgrading to, you know, any of these downstream releases over time. Well, not really downstream, but they would be like later releases. In other words, so 127 into, you know, 130, 131. I'm probably doing the math somewhere wrong in those versions, but conceptually, I mean, that's a huge sort of testing and compatibility effort that y'all are taking on. Is the thinking that that's going to be something that's going to be an Azure only thing, or is this something that also gets pushed into the upstream branch for AKS?
That's a great question. So the first, and there's two parts to it. The first is our LTS branch is already actually public in open source, so we never planned to make that a you know, purely downstream closed branch that only we hold. Everything that we would ever do is always going to continue to be upstream, and in fact, it would be used by other of our flavors, you know, like HCI and our edge off, for instance, things like that. And customers would have access to literally those commits in the open and to anything that we're adding to it. However, our goal was always to use this also as a conduit to restart the conversation upstream and to actually ensure that everybody in the community is able to actually benefit from something like LTS, because these are not things that are specific to Azure customers. This is completely universal in terms of the need. And obviously, we would love to kind of contribute and to drive this conversation in, you know, the community, but it's been dormant for quite a long time, and not a lot of, you know, peaked interest in restarting it. And you know, that our customers were still quite pointy about it, and so we definitely wanted to create here a middle ground where we can serve our customers and maybe find a way to reignite that conversation. And actually, that did happen. So there's currently a public PR and request to actually restart and kick off or re-kick off the working group for LTS upstream. And a lot of our folks are naturally involved in those discussions, and also to kind of spearhead that working group. And hopefully we can actually bring all of this that I just said and actually you know, replace in place everything I just said for AKS, but for Kubernetes all up and drive it in the community. Because again, everything that we would be going to be doing anyway was going to be in the open in the first place. It was going to be coming from you know, the main branches of Kubernetes in the first place. And as you mentioned, we would always allow people to go from one LTS to the other. And while that, you know, other LTS is in the upstream support window, you can even exit, you know, and go back into upstream support and continue that one if that is, which I think is super important for you to actually go back into that, you know, happy path of the rolling train. But having, you know, the community and Kubernetes itself have an LTS version that we can contribute to, that we can collaborate with the rest of the community, was always a goal of ours with this announcement. And so it seems to, you know, have actually sparked a lot of great conversations within the community and a lot of interest, because I think, as you mentioned, this is universal. So a lot of other folks have been hearing that from their customers as well. So we actually hope to bring everything that I just said upstream to Kubernetes really soon.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's great. I mean, I think this is, you know, again, not to harp on it, but I think it is absolutely a balancing act that y'all are trying to do. Of, you know, you want to drive. I mean, you're part of Microsoft. You want to drive, you know, Azure adoption and Azure use, but you as a team, y'all are hugely committed to the concept of this being an open source portable platform. And you know, while yes, our customers are asking for it, I think you and I have been on multiple email threads over the last couple of years of some customer somewhere begging and pleading for, you know, a couple of months, you know, extra. This really removes some of that fear, right? That will remove a potential adoption blocker for an enterprise that's saying, hey, I want to do this, but I just can't keep up for whatever reason. Now that, you know, that's one less thing removed as a blocker. That's great.
You know, I've had this discussion about, you know, which version of Kubernetes you're in. You know, oh, I only had deployed this version, and is it compatible? when building typical cloud native application, George, I hope that the exact version of Kubernetes is not like super important to the average, enterprise developer or enterprise customer, right? I mean, they should be, okay, they're writing, with C++, C# or Golang code or whatever it is, and it'll run pretty much, in any version of Kubernetes. I'm guessing where this is really important, this version specific thing, is with the vendors, right? The vendors that are making products that maybe add on to AKS or bolt on or other third party systems. That's where maybe the competitor, like things like, I don't know, like the CSI driver or whatever. Like the low level stuff is where things are going to get really hairy. How do you make sure that, hey, you've covered all these, like the LTS version is going to be supported by, let's say, a Twistlock or an Aquasec or somebody like that, right? You obviously want to make sure that they're also going to be on board with your LTS plans.
Yeah, so there's really two pieces on that. Is another good question. So on one hand, yeah, we would love if all applications were cloud native, and frankly, over the last few, maybe couple of years, we've actually seen a big shift. As for example, our adoption of auto upgrade and similar features has completely spiked over the last, in particular, the last year, I would even say, to more than 200% increase over that last year of what it was before. And so we see that more and more, that applications are more cloud native and more resilient to the upgrades and prepared, not just resilient, prepared to the upgrades. Our upgrade has a quality of service that is above 99.95%. So it very, very frequently succeeds or stops on behalf of high availability, prioritizing that. But it's the applications themselves that oftentimes struggle with it. And the reasons why that happens are, yes, sometimes self-inflicted when maybe there's dependencies on specific API versions that are deprecated from one Kubernetes version to the other. And in order to do that, if I may plug some of the other announcements we did at KubeCon here, we've actually shipped a breaking change detection into the upgrade operation itself, where if you actually click upgrade or trigger the upgrade, and you've had an object in the cluster that is using a different API version that is removed, that is already, and for some years now, being automatically changed in etcd. But the issue happens when things like operators, controllers, the code itself of an application is using an API version, API server version for Kubernetes that is in code, hard coded at the specific version. And if that version goes away, then that code's going to break naturally. And so there was really no way for us to automatically do anything to fix this. So what we did is we actually detect if there's any call being made to the API using a deprecated API and one that is going to be removed. And if that's so, we're actually not going to start the upgrade. So we actually hope that that's going to solve a lot of the issues that we see in our support kind of efforts with customers and with our support teams. But the bottom line there is, for even decrease of risk and mitigation, as I mentioned, sometimes there's just a legacy workload, and that specific workload is the one that customers don't really want to do. They have everything else, and this happens. Like 90% of our estate is, in auto upgrade, and we just let it go, and we're super happy with it. But that one case, though, we really would wish that we had more time, because it's just so hard to move that one. It has so many dependencies that we need to validate. It is so mission critical that we really need to do it. Or sometimes the vendors, and you mentioned that on the second part of your question, might be doing some validation. They might, okay, we're validated for this version, and they sometimes themselves don't have time to do the validation on other versions and be the same with other providers. Some providers are not actually being able themselves to keep with the Kubernetes rate, so that's always challenging as well there. And so the crux of it is, while we did and we continue to recommend people to stay there and to make their applications cloud native and resilient to upgrades, we also wanted to respond to those very, very pragmatic needs that the ISVs and other customers have been asking us, and provide that additional time so that they have that, to some extent, peace of mind and also extra time to do those migration windows and those upgrade windows. And so for an ISV or someone to do it, it's really all about, if that's validated in 127, it's going to continue to work and to be validated in 127. And then they have the time to actually validate it in either the next LTS or even in a different version. And as I mentioned, as a customer, you can actually move that LTS into another LTS while it's supported, and then exit to the regular trains, and so be able to do that. So you're not forever stuck in the LTS train if you don't want to, which I think is important as well.
Yeah, I think you may have sort of hit on this when you were talking about different workloads, and then maybe you've got this one mission critical workload that you want to put on LTS. What guidance do you give people who say, hey, I have a dev and a QA and a prod environment, and yes, I want my prod to be on LTS? Do you have some general guidance that says, hey, you should run your dev environment in auto upgrade, and your QA environment maybe in semi-manual, and then your prod in LTS? Or do you have some guidance for that, or best practices you recommend, or still maybe working that out as you figure out how LTS is going to work out in the real world?
Very interesting question, and we do have our KubeCon roundup blog does kind of
okay. We'll put a pointer to that in the show notes.
More holistically about upgrades, because it is tied to all of this that I mentioned before. So generally speaking, you definitely don't want to have a mismatch, right? You don't want to have your prod, on 127 LTS, and then your dev and staging and auto upgrade, and then it's on like 129, and then you're in different, validations pieces. What typically we see is we have and recommend that we have the different environments following the same strategy, usually at different stages, right? So you want to, maybe start with your dev cluster, followed by QA, etc. When you're doing, for example, auto upgrade, you want to have a maintenance window or an upgrade schedule for that auto upgrade to, hit
week
the
before
dev first,
or something like that.
staging second, and then prod third, so that you're able to actually see those changes there and update them there. If you're doing manually, the same thing. You want to do that manually across the board for each one of them in this area, but you typically want them to be running, around the same versions, or because of the same issues, right? You want to test the application in the Kubernetes version, and with all those components that you have from Kubernetes being exactly the same across the board. That's typically what we recommend. And if you're using LTS, that means probably you need to have an environment for that workload that needs LTS that is also in staging and dev. So you'll probably want to have 3 LTS environments, or however many you might have, that follow exactly that same purpose.
Is there any region affinity or whatnot with regard to LTS, like when it comes to rolling that, making that available, or is that just one of those things that's available everywhere?
It's one of those things that it's available everywhere. It's kind of the favorite answer.
That's good to see. Yeah. This is very useful. I mean, having that extended support, I think, for AKS is going to be huge for our customers. I guess the follow-up question to that is like, how do they like, if you want to test if this is going to work with an LTS version, do you just recommend just flipping from what they have now to the LTS, test it and go back? Is that like an easy transition, just going back and forth between the various versions, for example, or do you recommend them spinning up a new cluster with that version, kind of done from scratch? Like, is that any different from just moving from version to version, for example?
It's a good question. So there's a few different ways depending on what the workload needs. I think the most common way that we're probably going to see is for folks to stagger their next upgrade or plan their next upgrade to go to 127. Again, coming from different places, we already heard from multiple users that they're already trying to put their calendars together to get that, so that they then can benefit from the maximum amount of time possible. So if they're now let's say in 124, they're probably waiting. Okay, you're gonna get 27 out. We're gonna immediately plan our upgrade so that it goes 24, 25, 26, 27, and then we're gonna leave it there, and we're gonna do it all at once in one go maintenance window, and then we're gonna leave it there, and turn LTS on when it kind of goes out of the support period, so we can extend that in a supported way moving forward. That's probably how we're going to see a lot of the users do it. Now, we do expect a lot of them to also do it in stages. Some of them might want to get actually the kind of almost freeze ability of just like putting it on 127 and then just let it be there, maybe on a patch update scheduled, and that's it. We're probably going to see another type of users and needs where they might actually do for it close to the time it finishes in their own schedule. Like, okay, it's fine now. We're happy with it. And maybe we're running 126 or 125, or we just did the 125 recently, and we're kind of happy with it. And so we're actually going to be getting to 127, say, in a year's time, and then we're going to benefit from that extra year at that point. So, but in both cases, it's very much just getting to 127 and then turning on LTS.
So I think the only last question I have sitting in my head is, so if I want to leverage LTS, do I have to pay for this? Is this just sort of included as a version and all the standard pricing and everything works, or is there a premium with using LTS?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're quite open about it because of the effort that it takes. So LTS is part of the premium tier for AKS.
Okay, which there's lots of reasons to be on premium tier. It's not just LTS.
And so the price for it is 60 cents an hour. So it's not we're not trying to actually.
That's for premium, the premium SKU, not LTS sort of in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's correct. And so the 60 cents an hour, it's kind of a uplift from the standard tier, which is 10 cents an hour, and still is a very, I would say it's a price not for us to actually make a bunch of money on. It's pretty much for us to actually try and make this sustainable, that we actually are able to do all that patching and have all the infrastructure for testing and do all the work for all folks and all the reviews and everything that is quite laborious, as I mentioned before. We're just literally trying to offset that as much as possible. And as the price will say, it almost looks like a very, very, very cheap price for an LTS, which we tried to make it cheap as possible without making it, also without trying to recommend that LTS is a thing. Because again, as I mentioned, we recommend people to stay on the train, the support train. They're going to get a lot more benefits, and the applications will thank you for it later on. But yeah, it is a paid part of the paid tier and part of the premium tier for AKS, and you're just trying to offset the cost there.
Okay, yeah, and again, I think putting it in premium makes sense because there's, I think premium is what brings some of the availability SLAs for the APIs, and some of the other stuff as well. So there's lots of good reasons to be on premium if you're a critical workload. This is just, I don't know, depending how you frame it, you could almost say this is adding to the value of premium, right?
So there's 3 tiers to get the naming there. So there's the free tier where the control plane is fully free, and it's great again for tests, PR based development environments. It's just like fantastic. We don't plan to get rid of this because we think it brings so much value for users. We've heard so much, for tests and dev environments, so easy, just out of mind, out of sight, and then you stop the cluster and you for dev, and it's so economically interesting. On the other hand, then you got the standard tier. That's where you get the SLAs for the API, where you really should be looking at running production at your minimum tier there. And then you got premium, where you got some of these more expensive features, such as LTS, where we might need to offset costs, and that's usually the type of features that have cost that we incur on. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but that's where we offset that cost basically.
Okay, makes sense. No, great. Well, no, George, appreciate you coming on to talk about this. I think this is a huge development for the space, and I love that y'all have stuck to your sort of standard principles, right, of pushing this back into upstream. Who knows? Maybe we're back talking in a in a year or two about, wow, this is now a thing everywhere, right? And so that would be great. Awesome.
Hopefully, absolutely.
Any last questions or anything?
No, thank you very much to the team for doing this. Really appreciate all the work that you put there.
George, any last things? Or I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just thanking everybody for for the continuous feedback and having patience as we mull around everything and try to do the right thing for all of y'all, all the customers and users, and also the community, and hopefully we've managed to do that this time around, and we continue to do it. So just thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks again for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.